Good morning and welcome. My name is Randa Fahmy and I'm on the board of directors of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues on the board of directors to our first annual, and what I call our inaugural conference, which has been organized in partnership with the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. I got lots of emails before I came here this morning about what is the Arab Center Washington, D.C., and you'll hear more about that from Khalil. But bottom line is the Arab Center Washington, D.C. strives to do something that has never been done before here in Washington, and that is to provide insights and understanding about the Arab world here in the U.S., and also provide insights on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. I'm pleased to see many of you here today, some old friends, and I look forward to our interesting and enriching conversations, which are going to be give and take through our panel discussions today. I hope you will be able to connect with us at Arab Center Washington, D.C. as it continues to grow under the leadership of our executive director, Khalil Jahshan, and his very capable staff. If you're not already on our email lists, please do so in the back where you signed up and registered. I know many of you know Khalil, and he needs very little introduction to this group because he's been in Washington quite a long time. But I would like to say some very personal words about him. Throughout his career, he has served in many leadership positions, including the boards of multiple Middle East organizations, and he's actually run many of these organizations quite well, including the National Association of Arab Americans, ANERA, MIFTA, and Search for a Common Ground. I had the pleasure, many years ago, of working with Khalil at the National Association of Arab Americans, and I can honestly say from a personal perspective, and I guess we have to keep in mind that I've worked for presidents and senators and lots of other people. He was probably one of the best people that I've ever worked for. He ran the National Association of Arab Americans tremendously at a time when understanding about Middle East foreign policy was so necessary. So when he called me and asked me to serve on the board of the Arab Center Washington, D.C., I gladly accepted and so proud to be able to work with him again. Khalil is also a regular political commentator on both American and Arab media, including Al Jazeera, Al Arabi, CNN, Al Arabiya, and C-SPAN. Without further ado, I will turn it over to the Arab Center Washington, D.C.'s Executive Director, Khalil Jahshan, who will set the stage for our conference and introduce our guests. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Randa, for your kind introduction. The Arab Center Washington, D.C. Is a new organization. Of course, most of you know that. We just started our activities here in Washington about a year ago. We are pleased to host this first annual conference on democracy in the Arab world, the Obama legacy and beyond, in partnership with, as Randa said, with the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies, and we really appreciate their partnership and in an active and welcoming way, and we hope that will be the beginning of a partnership that would last for many years to come. ACW, Arab Center Washington, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization located here in the District of Columbia that is dedicated, as Randa said, to providing insight on the economic, political, and social life in the Arab world, and also analysis on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Arab Center Washington is affiliated with the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, ACRPS, headquartered in Doha, Qatar. ACRPS is one of the premier independent, if not the premier independent research institute in the Arab world, with particular interest in the social sciences, regional history, and geostrategic affairs. Its research publications, educational projects, and public events focus on the issues and challenges relevant to current developments in the Arab world. As we gather this morning for our first annual conference, the Arab region continues, ladies and gentlemen, to face great challenges, especially with regard to democracy, human rights, and national security. The onset of the Arab Spring in 2011 gave hope to millions of people across the Arab world, and many more worldwide, to be frank, that change is possible and that democratic transition and reform can be achieved in this turbulent region. More than 5 years after the Arab Spring, the region remains in a downward spiral, unfortunately. Today, some Arab countries are struggling to realize effective and peaceful transition to democracy. Few have descended into civil war. Others are in anarchy or on the brink of collapse, and most Arab autocracies maintain their repressive grip on power. The choice of democracy in the Arab world as a title for this conference was not a casual or incidental choice by ACW or the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. Both institutions are deeply committed to democratic transition in the Arab world, both in theory and practice. Therefore, we pooled our resources together to bring you today an unprecedented, I would say, group of renowned experts, both scholars and practitioners, to examine the events of the Arab Spring, the factors that led to failed or to undemocratic transitions, the missed opportunities by U.S. foreign policy makers, and provide recommendations to the next U.S. administration with regards to the promotion and strengthening of democracy and human rights in the region. We will begin this opening session with a keynote by Dr. Azmi Bishara, the General Director of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, and Chair of the Board of Trustees of the newly established Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. As many of you know, Azmi is a prominent Arab intellectual, writer, and political figure. He spent the past 4 decades advocating, teaching, and writing about the need for democracy, respect for civil and human rights, and struggling for just and lasting solutions for the region's most intractable conflicts. His most recent publications, relevant to this conference, of course, focus on the Arab Spring and the yearning for democracy throughout the region. His books include, and I will just mention 3 or 4 out of a long list of publications, The Glorious Tunisian Revolution, Analysis of Process and Structure, published in 2012, Syria, The Arduous Path to Freedom, published 2014, Religion and Secularism in a Historical Context, published in 2015, and his most recent 2-volume work, The Revolution of Egypt, From Revolution to a Coup d'etat, published this year, 2016. Bishara is the recipient of the prestigious Ibn Rushd Prize for Freedom of Thought in 2002 and the Global Exchange Human Rights Award in 2003. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Humboldt University in Berlin, Germany. Azmi, who will be joining us via video conference from Doha, has graciously agreed to respond to a few questions from the audience at the end of his presentation. If at any time you have a question or a short comment, please use the cards provided in front of you on the tables and identify yourself, your affiliation, and write your questions. And raise your hand with your card. Staff will collect those, and we will read them so that Dr. Bishara can answer those. Now, without further ado, please welcome Azmi Bishara to kick off our conference.
Thank you, Khalil. You can hear me, right? I think.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I think I should say good morning, although it's here like 5 o'clock. So, afternoon. I'm very happy to be in Washington again after so many years. Anyway, congratulations for the topic of the conference. The issue of democracy is suffering really a setback, a regression in the last few years, in the last 2 or 3 years actually, and we think it's very important to raise the issue again on the agenda, especially in the Western academia. The issue of war on terrorism became actually first as a priority in research and also in the media. And we think that the war on terrorism is a very important topic, of course, as a security matter, but it's not posing anywhere in the world political alternatives. Until now, in the last decade, everything that was done under the title of war on terrorism actually did not achieve much, at least in the third world and the Islamic world and in the Arab world. So we think that the issue, it will be a grievous mistake if the issue of democracy is put low on the agenda. It's still a crucial issue. As long as despotism prevails, the issue of democracy must be a central issue. As we shall see, it is also connected in many ways to the issue of violence and terrorism. In a way, actually, in 2011, we thought we finally refuted the so-called hypothesis of Arab exceptionalism concerning resistance or reluctance of the Arab world to join the democratic transformation in the world. Many believed that this is actually the historical process or the so-called right side of history. Anyway, we thought that in the year 2011, Arab people went to the street in massive protest, not only for a specific, against a specific policy, but against the ruling regimes as such. In the description of these regimes, words like despotism, corruption, etc., were used, and everybody actually in the Arab world knew that the Arab regimes grew very common characteristics among themselves. Even the republics had, with the time, grew kind of dynasty, hereditary rules, combinations of security apparatus and new elite of business people. A new oligarchy actually prevailed in many of the Arab countries, and the Arab masses, the Arab people who went to the street to protest, actually demanded democracy. They spoke about change, about human dignity, about justice, and other values that can only be achieved in a democratic free society. Democracy sometimes was even raised as a parallel, if not as a political program. We thought that we were seeing a dream materializing, but unfortunately, today we can speak about a dream turning into a nightmare. Violence and civil war erupted, and a real dispute is a real disagreement between Arab elites concerning the responsibility for the eruption of violence is taking place. And I can summarize it actually in one condensed question. Is it democracy or its failure that should be blamed for the violence? The old regimes impute the responsibility for violence to the forces of change, to the yearning for democracy. We believe, or Arab Democrats at least believe, that the responsibility for violence has to do with the failure of democracy, among whose myriad of causes the brutality of the old regimes do not come least. The brutality of the old regime hold a lot of the responsibility for the eruption of the violence. Their reaction, the kind of unscrupulous reaction against the employment of violence, against the yearning of the Arab people for change, is responsible, or at least partially responsible, for the violence that erupted afterwards. As you know, heads of state were forced to abdicate in 2 states at least, in Tunisia and in Egypt. And the lesson that was drawn from the resignation of these two leaders, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali and Mubarak, by other leaders in the Arab world was that these two presidents did not use enough force. And actually, the solution would be to use more force against the peaceful demonstrations. And no people in the world can face real armies if the armies stay on the side of the regime. In these two cases, in Tunisia and in Egypt, the armies had their own agenda. A small army of Tunisia, a professional army, if you want, which was discriminated against in comparison with the intelligence agencies, did not side by the regime in 2011. In the case of Egypt, the army had its fears from the turning of the Egyptian rule into a hereditary rule of civilians, of a new civilian dynasty, actually. And they had some fear for their prerogatives, for their privileges. So they did not side by Mubarak. They wanted to use the opportunity in order to help a change in Egypt. So it's not that these two presidents did not use enough violence. They couldn't use enough violence because their armies had different agendas. But anyway, people like Assad and Ali Saleh and Gaddafi thought that the mistake of these two presidents that they did not use enough violence. And in their case, they can use the armies because other kind of realities prevail in these countries between the army and the regime. We call it vertical realities that have to do with all kinds of sectarian sub-state affiliations. And the armies in these two countries really turned into militias in the last few years, engaged in civil war against their own people. So the events devolved into a kind of civil war, into violence. And this caused, or this opened, historical opportunity, if you want, to think about the problematic of democratic transition in the Arab world. In the case of Egypt, which still is a major Arab state, and where the democracy opened a window for hope for the Arab people and affected people in Syria, in Yemen, and other countries, the incompetence of the old oppositional elites to engage in compromises, to reach compromises concerning the character of the state, and their inability to agree on principles of democracy, even if they disagree on everything else, pushed parts of them to agree to ally itself with forces of the old regime, including the army. We think that the political culture of the Arab elites, not of the Arab people, not of the Arab society, it's not about Islam or Arabism, it is about the political culture of the political elites who cannot agree on democratic principles and conduct pluralism on all other questions. That is to blame first for the failure of the transition for democracy. From this question, we can deduce another very important question, which is a specific part of this elite that has to do with the Islamic political movements. We think that, or we learned at least in the last few years, before the revolutions, many Arab Democrats thought that it is it's actually impossible to convince Islamic political movement to engage into democratic transition without allowing them to do so, without giving them the possibility to integrate in the political process. We thought that this is the only way that moderate political Islamic movement can integrate in the political process. They should be allowed to practice their political rights. And the only way to learn swimming is to get into the water, to swim. There is no way to do it theoretically. So we thought that big political movements that are not marginal cannot be just ignored and subsided. They have to be integrated in the political movement. Since 2011, we learned that this is not enough, that this political Islamic movement, the political religious movement themselves, have also to agree on issues of democratic principles, not only on democracy as representation and majority rule, but on the principles of democracy concerning civil liberties. It is not Islamization of society that makes people afraid of change, or what we call in Arabic ikhwanization, or akhwana, from ikhwan, which means brotherhood. It's not this that makes people afraid, because the Islamic Brotherhood did not even have the time, the chance to ikhwanize society, to Islamize society, which is anyway a Muslim society. The problem was the fear of middle classes for civil liberties and for secularism, not as an ideology. Very few people know what is the ideology of secularism in this part of the world. About secularism as a style of life for middle classes and upper middle classes, to learn to respect also civil liberties. We think that for research in social sciences and for us as research center, the issue of the political culture of the elites in the Arab world, their inability to agree on compromises to enable democratic transition on the one hand, the issue of the political Islamic movements and their relationship, actually their problematic relationship, not with democracy as majority rule and representation, but as principles of democracy and civil liberties, have to be discussed if we want to understand and to learn for the future. The third question I think that we learned from if you want, the failure of democratic transition in this round of democratic transition, at least, to be more accurate, was the issue of the army in politics. The kind of the Arab armies, the structure of the Arab armies, until now in many Arab countries, in several Arab republics, the army played, like in other parts of the third world, as a modernization force. Even the United States in the 50s and the 60s have bet on the army to be the modernization tool. Remember that the United States and other Western countries, but particularly the United States in the 50s and the 60s, supported military coup, thinking that armies are the tool that can modernize societies and evade the possibility of transitions that happened in China and other places in the third world because of the inability of the old regime to solve the peasants' question. So parts or big armies in the Arab world, the Egyptian army, the Syrian army, the Algerian army, played a very important role in nation building, in transition or in modernization. In other places, it was used by political elites in what we can call now identity politics, to win loyalties for the regime through affiliations that have to do with region, sect, tribe, religion, etc. What we can know subnational affiliations or sub-state affiliations. In these cases, the army usage, the army exploitation in politics became catastrophic. The case of Yemen is one, the case of Syria is another, and the case of Gaddafi, who actually dissolved the army and built units that are affiliated with tribes and commanded by his sons, directly by his sons. In these cases, the army did not side on the side of the masses or played a neutral role. It sided by the regime because of these affiliations. And it turned actually into a militia in a civil war. Remember, dear friends, that revolutions in general never succeed if they clash with the army. Not one revolution in the history of the modern history of mankind succeeded when it faced an army. The army either sides by the revolution or neutralizes its role. In all the cases where the army sides with the regime, either the revolution fails or turns into a civil war. And that's what happened in some Arab countries, including Syria. We have a lot of time, of course, to discuss these issues. You will have time now in Washington to discuss these issues. I think these three major issues are crucial for the future. We have to learn from the experience, from the very hard experience that we went through in the last few years. As I said, we witnessed ourselves how our dream turns into a nightmare partially because of the reasons that I mentioned. Of course, there are many issues that have to do with the legitimacy of the Arab state and the fragility of the Arab state because of the lack of legitimacy. It's a long issue. I won't have time to discuss it all. And I left the issue of the Obama legacy to the end because I didn't want to make the impression that I start by accusing the other or by blaming the United States for the failures of democracy in the Middle East. I started by the structural issues in the Arab society and in the Arab state that we have to deal with in the future. But because the title of the conference has to do also with the Obama legacy, I will say some words concerning these issues in very shortly. From the beginning, I think, the Obama approach to the Middle East, you will be surprised of what I say probably because he's very intellectual. I do believe that he's an intellectual. But his attitude to the Middle East was superficial, yes, even shallow-minded. Because it was driven by a simple negation of his predecessor, not more than that. All the attitude, the political approach to the Middle East was decided by his will not to do the mistake of George Bush, which is a simple negation. He didn't look at the things concretely. This is for one. Second, everything that is not solved by rhetoric, he turns his back to. Somehow, there is a feeling that things are solved by talk, by rhetoric. In the case of Mr. Obama, I felt, at least also as an intellectual probably, that he suffered from the same stereotypes of many Western liberals. The Middle East is difficult, it's complicated, it's factionalized in an impossible way. You don't want to mess around or displease, at least enrage Israel. This approach, I think, dominated at his time. From the new cons, against whom we demonstrated in Palestine, at least when I was in Palestine. I went even as far as to London to organize demonstrations against the involvement in Iraq. And I do understand the tendency to try to evade their mistakes, to avoid their mistakes, including the involvement in other countries and the attempt to impose democracy by force in other countries. But from this, turning into the realism of the shallow kind of going to King Abdullah to say, I came to learn from your wisdom, for example. Or appearing in Cairo to say that we don't want to teach anybody democracy. To be so late in understanding what is happening in 2011 on the new generation in the Arab world, the yearning, the new generation for democracy. And last but not least, which is very important, I think, the ability to understand of Western colonialism. The mistakes of the new cons in Iraq, again, stem from this source. For example, dissolving the Iraqi army, which was one of the most important integration forms of the nation in Iraq. In the case of Obama, withdrawal without thinking about the vacuum and what may happen. You know, maybe the English colonialism did not learn a lot from the experience in Palestine, but we as Palestinians learned a lot from that. In 1948, the British withdrew from Palestine at a time where the vacuum produced by this withdrawal produced a catastrophe. Now, the occupation of Palestine was a crime, but the withdrawal without calculations caused a catastrophe. In the case of Iraq, the occupation was a real catastrophe, but the withdrawal in this kind of withdrawal was also a catastrophe. Without thinking about what will happen later, without thinking how Maliki is running the country, without thinking how Iran will fill the void, and just wanting to get rid of the problem. This attitude, or at least let me say it carefully, we cannot understand the development of ISIS in Iraq without three factors at least. One, despotism or tyranny under siege. Second, the occupation itself. Third, the sectarian rule produced by the vacuum after the withdrawal of the occupation. And I think a lot of thinking should be done about the way not only Iraq was occupied, but also about the way how Iraq was evacuated. In the case of Syria, and I don't want to speak about Egypt, where somehow the American administration behaved as unconcerned with a military coup against the biggest democracy in the Arab world in transition at that time, 2013. But in the case of Syria, red line after red line was broken by Assad, by the Syrian regime, was violated, and nothing happened. We thought at the time that leaving Assad without red lines would have been better than drawing with red lines and not doing anything when they are violated. Now, people try to confuse two things. American intervention, unjustified American intervention against a political regime in order to change it. That's what happened in Iraq. It was illegitimate. I am one of the millions of people who demonstrated against it. And this is one of the things that I did not change my mind about. We should have demonstrated against the American occupation of Iraq. This is one thing. But protecting civilians against war crimes is another. This is another thing, totally different thing. This is a human international obligation. Nobody is asking the United States or the so-called international community to intervene in Syria in order to impose democracy. The Syrian people themselves went to the streets. And crimes against humanity were committed against them, turning them from civilian protesters into actually militias. With the time, the army was used in a massive way, unrestricted, in bombarding, in shelling populated cities. More than 10 million people left their homes, 13 million actually, and about 500,000 people were killed. And it's still going on. This has nothing to do with intervention in order to change a regime. This has to do with an obligation to protect civilians. And I think this confusion was not done because of ignorance. I don't think that somebody as intellectual as Mr. Obama did it out of ignorance. And that's why we are, it is legitimate to present this criticism at the end of my lecture after saying after talking about all the structural deficiencies that made democracy so hard to achieve in the last few years. But still, the process is going on. I remind you, because of something very close to the United States. In Chile, 1973, 1974, a political transition was interrupted by military coup. In 13 years, political reforms started, and this time not by revolution, but by reforms, democracy was achieved again. I don't think the only way to reach democracy is revolutions. Usually, revolutions do not lead to democracy. You need even if you have revolutions, it needs a long process of reform to achieve democracy. The French Revolution, unlike what people think, did not lead to democracy. It led to a very authoritarian regime at the beginning. And it needed another century, about a century, to reach the democracy of the Third Republic. I don't think we will need a century in the Arab world. It will be much less. But let me say this at the beginning of your conference. It is legitimate to look at the events of 2011 until now as the beginning of a democratic transition in the Arab world that probably will take some years. We just passed the first phase. It was a very difficult phase, but it's only the first phase. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bishara, and we appreciate your generosity with your time and willingness to take a few questions from the audience. I will summarize some of these questions, and unfortunately, because it's a limited time, I'm not going to invite more questions, because otherwise, with the questions that I have here, we should be finished by next Friday. So we'll limit it to the questions that I've already received. The first question, Dr. Bishara, is why do we think revolutions should lead to democracy? A case in point is the French Revolution.
Well, I think that the French Revolution is an exception. People usually think about it as the rule. It is an exception in history. Usually democracies did not evolve out of revolutions. Usually revolutions led either to chaos, to civil wars, or to authoritarian regimes. Some of these authoritarian regimes played an important role in achieving justice. Not every authoritarian regime was a fascist regime. But still, after revolution, if political forces do not achieve a kind of political compromise, regulating the political game among themselves according to rules, including elections, independence of the judiciary, etc., etc. You know all these things. Democracy will not be achieved. If you know, in the Arab world, usually people think about the French Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, and the Bolshevik Revolution. In all these three revolutions, the outcome in the first 10 years was actually not democracy. It took time. Some of them was even a revolution against a democratic process, at least in Bolshevik Russia. The democratic process started and then the revolution against it happened. I think that the democratic forces in the Arab world have to be organized and be able to present an alternative. What we witnessed in the case of the Arab revolutions is unorganized political leadership of protests, of people who were angry, protesting against all the ills of the Arab regimes. But we can't say that the protesters themselves presented themselves as an alternative. They went home when the presidents in Tunisia and Egypt resigned. And the political forces who came to the front were the old oppositional elite. Now, this worked in Tunisia. It did not work in Egypt. In Egypt, the old political elites could not agree on the rules of the game. Some of them allied themselves with the army against others. So I think that the lessons that we can draw from here have to do with the importance of political reform. If it won't be possible, of course, I can't exclude the eruption of revolutions in the future. For that, political democratic forces must be ready with their program to present an alternative, not to depend on the old political forces to present it. It did not work. So either reforms, but if the regimes prove unable to reform themselves, then of course we cannot exclude revolutions. We should be ready for that with real political programs. Revolutions could be very dangerous in their outcome.
Thank you. This was a question by Stanley Kober, the first one. The next one is from Shima from George Washington University. She's asking, when you talk about Arab masses and failure of democracy, how much of it can be blamed on the patriarchal nature of Arab societies and disregarding particularly women's rights in transition toward democracy?
Well, actually, you raised the question of political culture of a society. I don't think we can change it before we reach democracy, or that we should change it, or that it should be totally changed in all issues before we reach political democracy. It wasn't asked from any people in the world. Most of the societies we know in the East and West are patriarchal society in different degrees. In Latin America, East Asia, in Africa, we are usually speaking about patriarchal society. Now, I suggest that we don't wait until we achieve equality, class equality, economic equality, and equality for women, gender equality, before we reach representative governments that can guarantee civil liberties. Probably, it's vice versa. I mean, women's rights were achieved after democracy was achieved and not before, and still it is a long struggle. As you remember, parliaments in England and in other places were constituted, and it took about 100 years to struggle for votes for women. In the case of Switzerland, 1966, women could vote only 1966, not so long ago. And I think that, of course, these issues should not be delayed. It's an issue of struggle. But democracy, let me say this, the obstacle for democracy in the Arab world is not the political culture of the Arab society. I believe it is the political culture of the elites, exactly the people who claim to be enlightened. Exactly the elites who claim to be enlightened went to the army to help them against their rivals when they lost elections, not the political masses. The political masses, whether they are patriarchal or not, male chauvinist or not, when they were asked to come to the ballots, they came and voted. And they did it wholeheartedly. They thought they are doing a patriotic duty when they went to the ballots to vote. They were very happy that some of their civil rights for a short phase of 2 years were guaranteed, that they had freedom. The alignments that were made against democracy were not because of political culture of the masses. It was because of the inability of political elites to reach compromises that have to do political rules or to accept a loss in elections. And exactly the people who claim to be the enlightened parts of society. But I do think that if I speak about democratic forces today, it can't be like democratic forces in 19th century England. In 19th century England, you could claim to be Democrat and liberal and not to accept vote for women. Today, you can't do that. That's why the transition in our countries is much difficult than the transition in the West. I hope that you understand this. It is much more difficult to do it, not only because of the level of development only, the degree of development, but also because all the society is involved. When democracy started in the West, 20%, 30% of the society was involved. The rest were excluded. Workers were excluded, women were excluded, etc. Today, we start by transition to democracy of the whole society. Everybody has the right to vote. Men, women, workers, people, landlords, people who owns nothing. Everybody has to participate. So it is a very hard mission, and it's many-sided. We have to be engaged in many struggles. One of them, of course, the equality for women, the gender issue. But I don't think that one issue should be delayed, that political transition, civil liberties should be delayed until other issues are solved. It is a process, the democracy is not a cure for all ills. It's not a panacea. It is only a cure for the issue of despotism. It won't solve everything. We don't think, we will be as incongruous as it may look, as it may sound. We may be looking like totalitarian Democrats or fundamentalist Democrats if we think that democracy will solve all the issues. It is a solution of one huge issue that has to do with despotism and tyranny. And I think it's a major issue in the Arab world, and that's why we're struggling for democracy. That's it.
We have several questions, Dr. Bishara, about Egypt. Basically, they could be grouped into two clusters. Would you care to comment on the current conflict of interest or conflict between Egypt and Saudi Arabia at this time? And also, would you care to comment about the authoritarian tendencies within the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt?
But it's becoming like a TV interview. Suddenly we have Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Anyway, these are very current affairs. I think that Egypt, the Egyptian regime, with all my disagreement with Saudi Arabia in most of the issues, but in this issue exactly, which is the support for the Saudi regime, of course, it was impossible to think about the success of the military coup without the support of some Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia. It's exactly like it was impossible for Pinochet to succeed. I do some similarities between Pinochet and Sisi, but not between Allende and Morsi, of course. In the case of Chile, without the support of the United States, it would have been impossible to do it. In the case of Sisi and his military coup against the democratic process, many Arab countries helped, including Saudi Arabia. Now, this is the way he's paying back his rapprochement to Russia and to Iran. Of course, it has to do with his blackmail of the United States. The United States looked very unconcerned in the issue of the military coup, but it did not have warm relationship to it. It did not agree to everything that Sisi was asking for. Instead of being grateful to this relationship, he made rapprochement with Russia and with Iran. I believe it's a deeper issue that has to do with Putinism. I would need a long time to explain, but I think the form of the powerful national leader, patriotic national leader, this model that is presented by Putin is very attractive for some leaders in the third world. And I think there is a kind of Putinism in the issue of emphasizing the sovereignty of despotic regimes as against the West and looking at democracy as a Western expansion. If you go back to the people who are around Putin writing, they look at any democratic transition in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, the Baltic states, etc., as Western expansion. They think in these terms about the Middle East. Every democratic transition is actually Western expansion against Russia, against Eurasia, how they call it. And in this case, Sisi fits in. They thought very positive about him. Remember the very negative attitude of the Russian regime against the revolution 2011. Again, some commentators in Washington forget it when they react to Russia's claims concerning Assad about Islamic radicalism, about violence, about Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, etc. There was no Jabhat al-Nusra and there was no ISIS in Cairo 2011, and Russia was against the revolution. Not because there was no violence. It was a very peaceful revolution. Remember, Russia was against the Egyptian revolution, not only against the Syrian revolution. And here, Sisi fits in this formula, I think. So he turned his back to Saudi Arabia. In this issue exactly, I'm sorry to say, I disagree with Saudi Arabia in most of the things, including ideological issues, political issues, and whatnot. But in this issue, it's a betrayal of Sisi, and it has to do with the way the United States is running the show in the Middle East. Oh, no. in the way the United States is not running the show in the Middle East, to be exact. Concerning the Muslim Brotherhood, I think that they are learning a lot. I hope that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, exactly, because it is the, let me say, the mother or the predecessor of all the Muslim Brotherhoods. In the case of Morocco, we see that an Islamic movement is emerging, which is very similar to the Justice Party of Turkey. I call them post-Islamic Brotherhood, actually. In Tunisia, there is a real development in accepting that Islam, in this case, can be an issue of identity, and the party should be a Tunisian party with an Islamic identity, exactly like the Christian democratic parties of Europe. And they have the right to have Muslim identity, but they are a Tunisian democratic party. The case of Turkey is affecting some Islamic movements, but the Muslim Brotherhood is still very ardent in the way they look at things because of this feeling of the victim. They are in jails. They were thrown out of power after fair elections, actually. They made some mistakes. But the way they are treated now in jails, torture, persecution, etc., I don't think is giving much of a time for them to learn from the mistakes they did when they were actually ruling the country.
There were several questions, Dr. Bishara, about making a linkage between Syria and Yemen. One part of the questioning pertained to, can these issues be solved separately, or do they have to be dealt with as a package? And has the second cluster of questions pertaining to Syria, Yemen, and also a little bit with Libya, has U.S. intervention in Syria and Yemen and Libya increased repression rather than ending it?
Well, in the case of Syria, let me say this first. I don't think there is a connection between Syria and Yemen, except the attempt of Iran to open a front in the Arab Peninsula against Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf regime, because the way Iran is thinking about the Arab East is as one strategic unit. They feel that they are under attack in Syria, Lebanon, so they opened a front in Yemen. The way Iran is looking at the Arab East as if it is one unit, at least one strategic unit. This is the major connection, actually, the Iranian connection. Because the other forces are not really involved in this way you are talking about. In Yemen, a real transition started, actually, and a national dialogue, a very developed, if you want, very significant national dialogue took place in Yemen. The Houthis participated in the national dialogue, and there are results, very clear results, and a democratic process, transitionary process started. It was peaceful, actually, until this decision of militias to commit a military coup with Ali Saleh, who was president of Yemen, and who was actually overthrown. So it is a military coup with a militia, supported by Iran. The solution in Yemen has to be through dialogue, because the Houthis are a social force that is considered a part of the Yemeni society. At the end, a political compromise must be achieved, and I think it is possible to achieve it. In this political compromise, I think all the forces agree that Ali Saleh, the president who was president of Yemen, doesn't have a place. I think everybody agrees, and I think the Iranis use him, but they will not be loyal to him at all. I think they use him But at the end, a political compromise can be achieved. The case of Syria is something very different from that. The case of Syria is a case of a people in upheaval against despotism, in a real uprising, a peaceful uprising. The Syrian people wouldn't have dared to start an uprising, a revolution, without the precedents in Egypt, Tunis, and Libya, especially Libya. They thought if people in Libya go out to the street, they can go. Their experience is brutal. They knew the regime from Hama. They did not dare to go out because they know the regime will shoot. But in this case, after the success in Tunisia and the half success in Egypt, and after the revolution erupted with the help of the international community, this model, I think, encouraged the Syrians to go out. Of course, I don't have to explain that this was justified, the kind of regime they lived under in the last 40 years, a regime that I know closely because I thought once that we can do things together against occupation and for resistance against occupation. But in the issues that have to do with the Syrian people itself, it was a totalitarian, I would say, fascist regime. It is a fascist regime, using sectarian affiliations in the attempt to control people. Now, if I look at the protests at the beginning in Syria, people I know personally some of them, men and women, intellectuals, workers, secular, religious, Alawis, Christians, Muslims, these are the people who went out. I know some of them personally. Many of them are dead, some in prison, some in exile. The man actually liquidated the civilian activists, the civilian, let me say, segment of the society who went out to the street, either in jail or in exile or killed. What happened? A real demographic transformation happened to the revolution. The middle classes, the civil forces were liquidated, were killed actually, or exiled, or put in jail. So other segments of the population came into the city, actually from the countryside with weapons. And in this case, at the second half of 2012, Islamic movements started to participate in the revolution. The West hesitated too long. It took too long for people to understand what's happening in Syria and to dare to do something. And let me say one thing. Again, as in the case of Egypt, Khalil, and dear friends, the fetish was the Israeli security. Again, you sacrifice everything. That's why Egypt, the United States was silent concerning the military coup, because many people thought it's good for the security of Israel. You sacrifice human rights, civil rights, etc. for the security of Israel. Again, chaos in Syria may be harmful for the security of Israel. Again, people think in a very autistic way, one-dimensional way about issues. They are very structured issues. Israel is one factor. There are lives of people. There is the issue of justice. There's the issue of equality. There's the issue of marginalization of the majority in Syria. I think that in this case, the Western policy, especially the American policy, was not up to the events. And I was against, I want to emphasize, I was against military intervention in order to change the Syrian regime, exactly like in the case of the Iraqi regime. I was against it, I'm still against it. But I thought that when the regime started using heavy weapons against civilians, it was an obligation to protect civilians. And because I thought that the Syrian people can change the regime itself. You don't need to change the regime for the Syrian people. I think this confusion still prevails. We should really start to understand the difference between these two things, between intervention to change a regime and a genocide that is taking place with silence of the so-called international community, not being able to do something to protect these people.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. As I said, we have time restrictions in order to move to the second part of the program, and time is the enemy of a good discussion, always. It was a pleasure having all of you here at this session, and definitely a pleasure to have Dr. Bishara give us this plenary discussion. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Bishara.